Salutations, One Dao, Wing Chun family, the entire Kung Fu clan. I am TJ, here delivering my video essay on Module 4, Sensing and Moving from the Center, or as I like to call it, the invisible conversation of Wing Chun. What does it mean to sense overall in Wing Chun? Not to anticipate with the eyes necessarily or guess with the mind, but to actually cultivate a whole body listening, a calm awareness that allows us to respond without panic, to move without losing connection, and overall remain aligned, especially when the pressure arrives. This module really highlighted that sensing is not some add-on skill. It's a hidden thread that ties almost every principle together. Structure alone isn't enough. Intention alone isn't usually enough. So without sensing, these parts remain disconnected. But with sensing, they harmonize into something literally alive. As Lao Tzu reminds us in the Tao Te Ching, the softest thing in the world overcomes the hardest. That which has no substance enters where there is no space, and what's softer than awareness? What's less visible than our presence? And yet it enters everywhere, turning resistance into cooperation, and overall turning force into flow. When the mind is still, they say, the body knows what to do. This is kind of the paradox of sensing, We don't manufacture it by effort, we uncover it with stillness. So how does something as ordinary as, for example, walking teach us this? The simple act of stepping, reveals a deep truth. When movement is led from the chest or the shoulders, it's stiff, it's clumsy and heavy, kind of like a soldier marching with absolutely no rhythm. But when we guide the movement from our belly, when the center takes the lead, each step becomes smooth, it becomes grounded and unforced, kind of like the earth itself is kind of welcoming the movement. So it's a reminder that walking isn't exactly neutral. Every step is either an act of centering or it's an act of finding your center again, kind of losing it and finding it again. The floor isn't a stage beneath us. It's a partner in the dialogue of our movement and our sensory awareness. If our awareness is scattered, the step announces that quite loudly. But when our center is engaged, the step itself actually becomes quiet power. And, then what about striking? What happens when a punch is thrown without sensing? These punches, look forceful and even dramatic a bit, but they're empty, like knocking on a door when no one's home. Lots of sound, but there's no real answer, right? So with the sensing engaged, however, that same punch resonates in an entirely different way. It's as if the whole house answers back when you knock on the door. The feet, the hips, the spine, the breath, all present in one unified strike. The punch isn't just a hand hitting something, it's your entire structure transmitting its condition through the strike. And the paradox is obviously undeniable. The weaker version of striking looks like work, looks like you're actually trying. But the stronger version looks relaxed, casual, yet the casual strike carries so much more authority than the forced or the labored one. I believe there's a Zen master, I can't remember his name, I think it's like Takun or something like that. He says that the sword that is eager that the sword that's too eager loses its sharpness, and the one that's held lightly cuts the deepest. And this is exactly what punches with sensing kind of reveal. The great effort in the end is ultimately effortless. And then moving into, what about pressure? Can sensing survive when something's pressing against us? And the spine gives us the answer there. A gentle push to the forehead is enough to reveal our standard habits. The instinct to stiffen the neck, to lock the chest, and to try to fight with muscle. And yet, all of these reflexes almost always betrays the structure. The correction isn't to resist harder, though. It's actually to allow the spine to roll, to ripple, and curve like a rubber band or like a bow, while maintaining this unbroken connection from the base to the crown. It looks softer, but in truth, it's much, much stronger because it didn't fracture. Once again, coming back to the Tao, what do they say? The straight tree is the first to be cut down. The crooked tree lives its life in full. Watching all the drills through this module really makes that truth obvious. Rigidity invites the collapsing, and flexibility ultimately preserves integrity. Then we moved into kind of like the crown and leg pressure tests within the module, which deepens the lesson. When the crown's pressed, everyone who resists with their necks kind of collapse immediately. But when awareness is dropped lower, when the base took the load, the entire frame holds ourselves with ease. Pressure is no longer an attack to be fought, but actually a signal to be distributed. And when pressure is applied, for example, to the thighs, the same truth, kind of appears. Brace with the quads and the stance gives way. But if you align through the center, the pressure dissolves, traveling through the entire body, isotonically, from core to every external point. One detail in this area kind of really stood out, that when properly connected, crown pressure, didn't just hold the body, it actually makes the practitioner almost appear taller, which is really good in a fight, right? So rising effortlessly under the force, true rootedness doesn't, press down into the floor. It uses that Taigong. It grows upward, and it supports it, and it's supported by it. The legs, though, are revealed not as necessarily positive supports, but as active participants in sensing. They're like little tattletales, exposing instantly whether awareness is completely unified or not. As one proverb says, the body is one piece. If you forget one corner, the whole shape collapses, right? So then how do two practitioners working on this together connect through our sensing? That center to center or center to center exercises kind of make the point. When attention lingers in the arms, the exchange turns kind of staticky, noisy, messy, unstable. But when energy is projected from the core, from the dantian, from the belly, the contact quiets into something really subtle and ultimately really steady. It's like two fighters kind of colliding, and the more the two centers introduce themselves, then there's kind of this silent handshake, a wordless introduction, a recognition that balance meets balance long before any strike is ever thrown. And in that recognition, Wing Chun becomes something more than defense or attack, honestly. it becomes conversation. So yeah, then kind of, what about walking or moving under pressure? There's some drills in the module that were kind of elucidated where a fist pressed into the belly, kind of makes this super clear. At first, steps with that movement seem strained and awkward, kind of like you're wading through a billabong in waist-deep mud. The harder the body tries to escape it, the heavier the body becomes, right? And yet, when the center takes the lead, everything becomes transformed. Walking becomes fluid, moving becomes fluid and smooth, becomes unhurried. That's a big deal. As if moving, had appeared beneath the feet rather than the feet are moving on top of something. And then suddenly the pressure isn't an obstacle at all. It just actually becomes part of a rhythm. And this kind of always reminds me, Bruce Lee, as he famously said many, many times, empty your mind, be formless, shapeless, like water. Water can flow or it can crash. What is that? Be water, my friend. So yeah, watching these drills, it was super clear. Water doesn't panic, right? When it meets resistance, it just simply finds its way forward. And here, in the walking drills specifically, water has learned to walk. So taken together, the lessons of this module revealed something, as simple, because we're reducing fractions in Wing Chun, simple, but profound in its simplicity. Sensing isn't a decoration. It's not a technique layered on top of another technique. It's the lifeblood that animates the entire system. Sensing turns into training. It turns punching into communication. It turns pressure into dialogue. It ultimately transforms martial arts from force against force into presence meeting presence. And I believe there's a Wing Chun teaching that kind of reminds us, to hold the center is to hold the whole. And sensing is how that holding is felt, how it's expressed, and how it's shared. So I guess the takeaway is this. Sensing makes Wing Chun less about what you hit and more about what you hear with the body. Ignore it, and you end up shadowboxing your own habits. If you catch it, you find yourself sparring with ultimate reality. And if you need a reminder, with a smile, don't forget the legs. They're the biggest gossips in the town, right? Leave them out and they'll expose you the second the pressure arrives. So overall, Module 4 is kind of sensing not as a theory, it seems to me, but as a living practice that follows with us and imbibes with us consistently and perpetually. It's not an extra layer on top of the art, but overall, it's an invisible conversation that makes the art whole. So I hope that clarifies some of the ideas around sensing with moving, sensing with walking. And thank you very much for listening. And we'll catch you in Module 5. Peace, love, and Kung Fu, folks.